my memory, I will always see the town that I have loved so well, where our school played ball by the gas yard wall, and we laughed through the smoke and the smell. Going home in the rain, running up the dark lane, past the jail and down behind the fountain. Those were happy days in so many, many ways, in the town that I loved so well. In the early morning, a short factory horn called women from Cregan, the moor and the bog, while the men on the dole played a martyr's role, fed the children and then walked the dog.
Now this is Stan McCormack. You know me as a local historian and writing local history books. But today I just want to say, have this idea of doing a walking tour right down the town. Starting here, we're on the green at the moment, and we work our way down the town to the far end. And it won't be the whole history, but it'll be part of different stories. And I do like to start with a bit of positivity, so I'm just going to, we're inclined to see the world is not so good at the moment, which is true, but there's a few things that have happened in Kilbeggan that give us reason to be positive. Don't mind me if I have to look down sometimes. The first thing I'd just like to mention is it's to do with the school. The Sisters of Mercy came to Kilbeggan in 1879 and set up the school. And that was part of the Kilbeggan for all the years down until 1964. I was one of the people in the first boys class. But what did change for them was that when Sister Pius retired, the school was taken over by Catherine Moynihan. But now it's reached a whole new level. There's now a great future for the secondary school under Garrett Farrell, with the work now on the 20 million new home in the Mercy School on the Dublin Road. And the number of pupils has doubled up to 650, which make with two-storey facility. That'll be between 2023 and 24. It took a lot of effort and energy to get to that point. The facility will have special educational needs and much more for the young people. But to me, it's even more than that. It will be, and it will be fantastic. But I also believe that that can be good for the town of Kilbeggan, and it's something that we can look forward to. The second thing I just like to mention is that it's to do with the canal. The committees have been working on the canal for many years with great success, and I'm sure people are familiar with the cycle routes and the walking routes. But now something even better has happened. The development was the news that a grant was approved of $500,000 in September 2021 to upgrade it. It was sponsored by the Westmeath County Council and Kilbeggan Canal Company. And this means there's going to be a project manager. They're looking at rewatering the Kilbeggan branch, which will be one of the first phases. And and then the second phase will see the greenway linking Dublin Galway cycling track at Streamstown. And Kilbeggan is in the heart of that, of this hub. The person who signed off that particular document was a great historian in Kilbeggan, Kitty Flynn, aged 96 and still secretary of that committee, and she signed off on that. And yet again, that's something that we can look forward to that might make a difference. The other, just to mention, all right, that with the church, in recent times, the church was done up, about over $1 million was spent with the great support of the local people. And this has been a great facility for those who attend the church, and something positive that they have for themselves. And there's facilities like you can listen to Mass outside. So they're only small things, but they're well, they're not small things, but they're important things that can make a difference to Kilbeggan. And it's not all bad, you know. So coming back to what I'm doing here now, I'll be brief about this. The Kilbeggan was first mentioned in the annals of Lough Kay in 1196, and the town was called after St. Beckon. And it was almost destroyed in the 10th century in a battle between the Danes and the Irish near the present bridge down at the distillery, at a site called Aghnacion, Ford of the Heads, 972, because of the number of the heads that floated down the Brosna River after the battle. The other point about that is the Cistercian monastery was colonised from Mellifont because Kilbeggan had building materials, water, timber, stones, and the Cistercians liked to build on a previous monastery site. A few years ago, using modern technology, the site was discovered on the west side of the old graveyard. And the other thing that I suppose happened in Kilbeggan, people mightn't notice it so much, but Kilbeggan, Oliver Lambert came to Kilbeggan in the 16th century, and he obtained much of the land in Kilbeggan. He did many good things, including a market in the town in 1612, and I even remember when a group of us had to get down in the square in Kilbeggan to make sure that the market was retained at that time. And the other thing that developed was that 2 members were sent to Parliament from Kilbeggan. We had 2 MPs for about 200 years, you could say, up to 1801. Now, they weren't ideal in the sense that it was the Lambert family and some other well-known dignitaries, as I say, and but yet it was good for the town, and it helped it, and it's a great piece of our history. The funny thing about the Lamberts, and I just to mention Gus Marshall, one of the great geniuses of Kilbeggan, he believes that the Lamberts lived where the water tower is. I'm pointing over there down the Tullamore Road, and that they had 3 exits from that house. It was down the current exit on the Tullamore Road. The other one was where Frank Larragy's pub is, and the other one was where the coffee shop is, in at the back. So you can picture them. They were up on the hill, but they were attacked by Hubert Fox, and he wiped out the houses, the cattle, the land and everything. And just to show you, the Lamberts had to literally walk out of Kilbeggan before they... Now, they were always continued to be part of the town because they owned it. But the other interesting thing about it, they made a claim for compensation in 1640s, and you know what they looked for? £36,000 pounds. So you can imagine the millions that they were anticipating getting. So that's the origin of Kilbeggan in a sense, like, you know. Now, I'm standing here in the green, and it covers a series of, I suppose, things around the area. For example, at the very back, down here at the wall behind me, there's a path across the green. You could take the shortcut from the Dublin Road across to go to the Mass. And that was completed by people like Michael Casey, Mick Clavin, Kevin Troy, Frankie Brewer, and people like that we know. I will be mentioning names as I go along because it's as much about people. And the green was used for other things. I'm not too far away here now from 2 plaques, but the green was used for the 1916 celebrations and the stories in Kilbeggan. The 2 memorials in the green to remember those who fought in World War I, and 23 died in Kilbeggan, bear in mind, but also the 1916 and 21, where 72 people from Kilbeggan were part of that, and John McGuinness was the local leader for Westmeath and Offaly. And then the green itself was part of our lives with the handball alley, which is built again behind us in 1929. And they also had tennis, kids playing football, and soccer over the years. The statue over here, of I am the way, the truth, the Christ King, that was for Corpus Christi, and that statue was out on the street, and we can all remember where you to walk down the street. It could be 700 or 800 people, and turn and come back and pray down there. And very often, I can remember in the sunshine, there was tar on the ground and people taking out their hankies to save the suits. But it was eventually moved in here. And the green was also used for many other things. For the Knighthood Festival, the race committee dances here, and the photograph taken on the green. And just the other thing, just to mention, that we're standing here, and on to my left is the families that were there over the years, like the Clavins, the Tormeys, the Walshes, the Donaghys, and there's the famous well there, just down the laneway, and that was all part of this. Now, I'm just to bring back the memories. I was saying, like, one of the biggest moments here on the green, it could be just over here from where 700 people were lined up, and Seamus Kelly on high took a photo down with TP O'Gorman and organised people like that. It was extraordinary because 700 people, and later on actually we got to 700 names, and I can tell a little story on that one. I had the 700 names in a book, and I was launching it was a different book, I think. And at about midnight, I walked up to get a drink, and someone said, "Stan, I was looking at the 700, and you know, one of them was wrong. You didn't have my cousin in, and you put in somebody else." So someone actually researched 700 names in a pub that night. The green has been active, like I say, from the markets for Corpus Christi, and the Handball Alley in 1929 was opened by Father Cassidy, and they used to have a tournament on the first Sunday of every month, and it was there for all the young men. Now, the other thing, as we stand here to my left, this is to do with there's a head constable shot dead to the left of where I am, and this happened in June 1922 on a Sunday morning before 8 a.m. The head constable, Hill, was shot in 5 or 6 places on his way to Mass, and he died within a few hours. He was stationed for 6 months here, and they came up, we know a number of people came up the lane, came across and shot him very close to where I'm standing now. That was a part of our history. And the interesting thing about it was another man, a sergeant, came up with him, and just 30 or 40 yards before this happened, he said he had to go back, he forgot something, and he wasn't there, which was quite suspicious in the circumstances now. Now, I'm just standing here between two plaques, and I suppose I've always had the belief that there was no distinction between those who fought in World War I and in the Troubles, and they were put up there, Michael Egan and Sean Craig. They're very simple, but they are close beside each other to signify the difference now, because in World War I, 23 people from Kilbeggan died, and that included families like there's Christy and Pat Neal, the same family. 2 of them were killed in 1915, and then the same happened with the Tormeys, Michael Tormey and John Tormey. They died in April 1915, and together. And John Lynack, he was the son of a tailor, he died as well. And I suppose one of the better known was Sergeant Dan Flynn, Kitty's relative. He was an officer, and he disappeared somewhere along the line, and it took weeks and weeks before they heard about them. So I wanted the 2 plaques to be there, and we had a fantastic day here during the festival. The army were here, and they said it was one of the best ones they attended. It was a lovely memorial, and I am proud of that, I have to say. Now, I'm standing here on the Dublin Road, and it's a famous street to many of us, but I just wanted, the buildings may not look like they did look in the past, but I'm just trying to bring back the life that was there and just show what it was like. And if you start at the very far one, The Liam C. Martin, the artist, he was a native of the town, and he's a son of Ambrose Martin, and his mother was Margaret, and they lived in Kilbeggan for many years. She had a photograph business, and she was in the local choir and played the piano. And Liam C. Martin is one of the best known artists. What he used to do was the Dublin sketchbook, in the 1960s, and Liam C. Martin's Ireland. And he spent a number of times in Kilbeggan. He painted the distillery and other buildings down the town. He also did a wonderful book on Faces on Ireland, and that was on RT television. So he was an artist that was very much associated with Kilbeggan. And the other interesting thing about them was that the first ever bacon slicer to arrive in Kilbeggan in 1924 was brought by the Martins. So that's a little tidbit for the records anyway. And he also got Association Man of the Year. So that might not have life at the moment, but you can see the life that was in it. Next we come to Siggy Daly, one of my favourites. Her shop is the next shop, and it actually, she took over Martin's, I think. I especially remember that we all loved Patsy Pops, and there were twopence, but sometimes you only had a penny, and if you only had a penny you went to Siggy Daly, and she would dip the ice into juice and it'd come up, and you'd suck it once and all the juice was gone, but it was the best you could do, and so that was Siggy, the kind of person that Siggy was. And next you came up to Coffee's shop, and Coffee's really was important to my generation because you used to come up to town and there was a seat there, and all the young people gathered up there, and a great friend of ours, Mary Coffey, was very young at that time. She was great with all the kids, but it was mainly Lara Coffey was a carpenter, and he did a lot of the funerals. But what I do remember is when you went into him, anytime I went in, this is what he said to me. I'd go in to get a message, and he'd say, "Mr. McCormack, was your father a foreman in an Eaton house or an Eaton house detective?" So that was Lauren's introduction to it. And then you move down next, there's Coffee's there as well, very much involved in the troubles at the time. Doreen Coffey was very political and loved all things Irish, and an Irish speaker. And beside them, there's the Clavin's house, and this is where this thing comes into place. Mick Clavin was a member of the IRA. The family were just over there, and he gave service and service time in Mountjoy, and his sister Mary was a member of Cumann na Món. But they had a personal family story, and we can show that with the film, whatever. The story of Thomas Clavin, that he befriended a prisoner there. The carving was given to Thomas by a fellow prisoner when he was serving in Mountjoy prison. The interesting thing about it is that it was made by one of the men that became known as the Forgotten 10. Some of these men served time in Arbour Hill prison before they were moved to Mountjoy. The man gave the carving to Thomas the night before he was executed and asked him to take care of it. And the carving had words on it like Arbour Hill, Round Tower, High Cross, Water and the Setting Sun, and it was made from a broken floor tile from the Arbour Hill prison. When Thomas was released from prison, he went to America, and the Forgotten 10 were executed, and probably the most famous one was Kevin Barry, that we know from our time. And then you just move on just to here. There's another family here, the Kleins. But the Kleins, Phyllis Klein, she was the daughter of Sean Flynn, but she was also the private nurse to Sir Chester Beatty, and accompanied them to France, French Riviera, to Rome, Monte Carlo and all of those places. And she met Prince Rainier coming from that. She nursed him at his home in Ballsbridge, and of course Dr. O'Sullivan was his doctor. So there's that connection with the famous Chester Beatty Library. Now I'm standing here, and there's a very good story about people of Kilbeggan and what sometimes things do go right for them. To my right, there's down here, there's the Tullamore and the New Road, and the story comes around that. That takes in St Mary's Avenue and Puddle Lane, it's called, that road around there. Because it's one of success for the people, in 1849 there was a turnpike proposed in the town, and Harbour Road and Tullamore Road. This is by the gentry. That's up this road, the Harbour Road, the Tullamore Road. They were going to bring in a toll right up to the town, which meant all the people coming in had to pay. And this was the problem. And it had been on the Dublin Road as far up as Joe Guilfoyle's in 1821, but they brought it up here. The Turnpike Company raised issues and wanted to charge. But a man, William Gannon, he was a apothecary and a surgeon and a postmaster, and he gave the people access, coming up the Tullamore Road, go around the New Road and into the square, and you didn't have to pay. And the people used that. And now Puddle Lane, or the New Road, that's there since 1640. It was only a little laneway before it became St Mary's Avenue, but that's there that long. And what happened then was they went to the judge with a court order saying that what they did was wrong, it was illegal. And you'd expect the worst. And it was very dramatic because someone had to get up on a horse and ride to Moat Court and get documents and come back. But it went to the judge, and this was the surprise, was that the judge said the case was dismissed by the judge. Number one, the summons was defective by the landlords, the toll gate was not legally erected, and no fraud committed. Great choice, and there was about 800 people out in the street, I think, drinking that night. But it was just a small story at a time when you wouldn't think they could win, and they did. The Grand Canal opened on New Year's Day in Kilbeggan in 1835. Paddy Farrell's grandfather got the contract to build it in 1812, but the Grand Canal Company discovered, and I think we all know this by now, the 3 to 4 locks it would take to bring it into Kilbeggan, so therefore it wasn't feasible. It was decided not to take it in. The house was built up as far as the roof, 200, and there was no roof for a long time. The canal company didn't want the building, and it was too dear to pay rates. The Lamberts family eventually put a roof on it. So that's why this was intended to be a hotel. It was intended to be a hotel, and that's what happened. So along here you can see, is it okay? Suites, organisations like the Suites who are doing computer courses, and but the main feature is this is really part of the Hennessy family, and going way back. Maura and Peter Nolan now and Cara at the moment are running the post office, and I hope everybody supports it. The Bank of Ireland was here, and when it comes to Hennessy's, father was born in 1899, and he had a garage going in Kilbeggan. Eugene and Johnny ran it, and the Hennessy's were originally from Moat, and then they were down in the square, I think, where Bernard was, before they moved up. And what they used to do, they had petrol, give out gallon, there was shop here, bicycles, petrol, oil tubes, they sold all those, and it was like a social place as well, and people who were in drama would know this. There was a billiards room, young men played darts here, cards, and Jerry Jennings used to rehearse his plays, and they'd put up a sign just out here, play in Hennessy's tonight, like, and people would gather. Now, Andy Hennessy, I suppose, was the original musician for Kilbeggan. We started with Des Coughlin, and he did all the work on ads and papers looking for the bands, mainly 4 nights a week. Nick Delahunty had 14 pieces, but he had 11 pieces. And his father even travelled with them. But he went on long journeys to Belfast. It was interesting. On a Sunday night in Northern Ireland, in the Plaza, he'd play on Thursday, and the Orangemen booked him for another date. The only thing he had to be careful about is that played an Irish national anthem in the Catholic dance, and God Save the Queen in the Protestant. And believe it or not, a man came into him in the Protestant one, and he said up the IRA, and about 50 of them grabbed this man, dragged him out, and he said, God, and he said, I feel bad about that. But about a month afterwards, your man turned up at a dance, and he said, are you okay? Ah, yeah, you okay. So they weren't too bad at all, like, you know. So you had that. But Andy remembers coming down from Belfast. For example, he was stopped by the British Army going down to Tipperary, and your man dryly said, it's a long way to Tipperary. He didn't know whether it was a threat or not, and then he got a warning several times. Andy, you're going to be stopped by the IRA on the way, but it's okay, they won't touch you, you know. So it was very difficult. But he's very successful, and in the off years he used to go to London, Birmingham, Manchester, and he had an offer to go to New York, and he just didn't do it anyway, and he never got round to doing. He never got round to producing a record. So that basically is what the Crescent is about. Like, I'm standing here just opposite McNamara's pub, but this used to be Roger Fox's pub, and it was a well-known pub for many years, and they used to get Jim Fox, I remember people know, came in the 1960s, and he ran it. But just beside it, there's a house there, and there's a very interesting character. I'll make this briefly. Paddy Guilfoyle, he was very much involved with the IRA, but he played a major part during the troubled times. But he eventually had to make a run for it, so he got a false documents, passport, and he went to America, and he worked there, but he worked his way up a company to the very top. But he had a problem. He wanted to come home, but he couldn't. So he went into the company and he told them the full story, and he said, I know you could fire me now, or you know, whatever, based on that. But so he used to be asked up for meetings, would you come up to do a meeting with his false name? So then they said, leave it with us. So the following morning he was waiting for anything. Next thing the intercom come up, would Paddy Guilfoyle please come up to the meeting? In other words, they accepted it without another comment, and Paddy was delighted at that. And he came back to Kilbeggan in around 1960 for a short time. But it's just a nice tidbit of how someone being accepted that had fought for Ireland. We're just standing outside a house here that is famous because Eileen Coughlin was a Kilbeggan artist, and she lived here. Well, they were a very, very well-known family. But Eileen, she had 3 sisters and 5 brothers, and she was born in 1909 and went to school in Kilbeggan. Her father was William Coughlin, a tailor, and his mother Mary McLennan. But she went to school in Kilbeggan and she studied in Dublin and became a commercial artist, illustrating children's books and school texts. She drew cartoons for the Dublin Opinion and weekly illustrated satirical articles on the Irish press, and she became very well known. She was a specialist in dust jackets, and even Sinead de Valera had 4 of her books illustrated. She died in Midland Hospital in April 1990, but is very, very well remembered. I'm standing outside Teehan's here, and it's a famous pub. You can see the sign here, and it was noted for pints and pans hanging on hooks outside, hoping people would buy them. Fair days, everything outside, 2 vats of grain inside the door for containers. On the big day, pigs at Fox's, sheep down the street to Dunnigan's, cattle in the square, wool stores at Kelly's going in and out, and you could fill it underground and wool come out this way. Mrs. Teehan, she was an unusual woman, and she used to come out during the fair with holy water in one hand and a drop of whiskey on the other to bless them. So it was a great mixed bag. The market was huge, and it was very hard to get from houses to Moran's Corner, where Mrs. Berry lived, and there was horse-drawn vans where Mick Dillon was. So it was a whole life here, and Teehan's are very much just bottled beer, and in time it caught up with them in the 1970s. I'm standing beside a famous place in Kilbeggan. This was owned by James Scally. He was a Kilbeggan merchant on Main Upper Street, and the family had a large drapery store in Tullamore. He married Claire Horn, and a very prosperous farmer. And his son Malachy was born in April 1870, and the family were very successful, but tragically it sort of went wrong for them very badly when in 19 days they lost 6 children, 4 daughters, 2 sons of their 10 children due to scarlet fever and typhoid. But Manco Scally was a son, and Manco Scally was an Irish aviator in one of the world's smallest planes. He was, GAA Skelly was his proper name, but he was the first Irish pilot to be granted permission by the Free State to fly a plane to a foreign country in 1932, and he flew in one of the world's smallest airplanes. His story is sort of astonishing. He was born in 1901, and he was excellent at sports like rugby and clay pigeon shooting, in which he won the Irish Championship in Wicklow against 200 contestants from Ireland, the USA, England and Scotland. He was often handicapped in his shooting championship because he was so good. But he left Kilbeggan in 1929 to work as a traveller for a gun and ammunition manufacturer. But then this is where it starts going wrong for Manco. He decided he wanted to fly up the plane, but he had no experience, so he spent 4 weeks learning how to fly a plane, which was the lowest, I say, in history. And on top of that, he bought one of the smallest planes in history. It was called the Shamrocket 1, and it was described as the smallest plane in the world. He was inexperienced, and while he was even practicing with the plane, he fractured his leg, and he was trying to fly the plane with the fracture. And this plane, you could reach out and touch the ground from sitting on this plane. That's how small and dangerous it was. But amazingly, he hoped to take off on another occasion. He hoped to take off from O'Connell Street, and there's a video online showing him being interviewed, and his plan was to take off and find later place and take off in Dublin. But of course, naturally, the police had to stop him. It's not really the thing to do is to take off on O'Connell Street and places like that. But anyway, he decided he was going to sail on, and he left the Leon Aerodrome, and the plane was making funny noises, but he decided to fly anyway. And sadly to say, he died and crashed in a place called Ber near Marseille. It's not a surprise, but it was a strange character who did so many things that were unique, but not very smart. So we come to Ryan's, which is was a famous place for many years. Albert and Frank, Albert was also part of it. That it was a store that everybody associated with. I did hear a little story from a person associated, and it was about learning how to pour a drink. This lovely lady, she decided to clean a glass by using fairy liquid. When a client looked for his glass of whiskey, the taste of the fairy liquid nearly killed him. So you'll have little tidbits like that in pubs. Well, I'm standing here beside a very historic building because this is the place where John McGuinness, who was the leader of the IRA in the Offaly and Westmeath area. He was born in Kilbeggan in a nationalist family and was a local teacher and joined the volunteers. He became commander of the Offaly Brigade in 1917. He was captured and put in jail in 1918 with Terence McSweeney and Kevin Higgins. He took anti-treaty side in 1922. He was imprisoned in Mountjoy even though he was a TD for Laois and Offaly. And in 1925, with other prisoners, he escaped to the USA but returned in 1928 and was imprisoned again and not released until 1932. Uh, the thing about him, an amazing thing about him, he used to play football for Kilbeggan while he was on the run, and there's a famous moment where he played in a football match, and the headline came up in a paper: McGuinness won and Black and Tans nil. That was the score of the match. On the 29th of October, where I'm standing now, just to my left, in this house, it was owned by McGuinness's. In October 1919, the soldiers came down and they went to McGuinness's house to burn it down, and his sister was present. They told his sister to go across and stay in Flynn's house, which is opposite here, and she's there, and she had to watch the family home being burnt down, and their pet dog was shot inside this house. Because of the Black and Tans, they fired many shots in the air, and funnily enough, the East York soldiers, English, they actually came down to this house and tried to help to put out the fire. And it was a terrible time because all the houses around here were raided, and families like the O'Reillys, Guilfoyles and that had to go on the run. And amazingly, during this very bad period, shots were actually fired into the Convent of Mercy, which is up the way. It was that dangerous in Kilbeggan at the time. Just the second top window just behind me across the road, it has it's a historic place, I suppose, for Kilbeggan. Many notable events took place in the square, such as Michael Collins giving a speech there during 1918 from the upstairs window in the Sinn Féin Hall, which is part of the Market House, across towards Dunnigan's pub. Jim McGuinness introduced him to the, funny enough, there's not much information about it, but Jim McGuinness introduced him to Paddy Phelan, and the Phelans owned a lot of the part here. Paddy Phelan was only a young man, and McGuinness said, "Do you know who this man is?" And Paddy answered quickly, "No, I don't know who he is." And Collins just laughed and walked away because he didn't know who he was. I'm just standing in the square here in Kilbeggan. We had one street with many little lanes like Creevy's Lane, Puddle Lane, Mill Lane, Commissary Lane, Sailor's Row, Taylor's Lane. They all go back to the 17th century. And many industries like candle making, farriers, saddlers, soap builders. And on the far side of the street on the north with ducks and geese, there was a pond across on the far side. There was no courthouse at that time or market house. The Dublin Road was where the Harbour Road is, and the Mullingar Road was through Newtown. Mill Lane was a boring down to Coolah. So it was a different world than we are in now. The funny thing about this always comes up, the beautiful houses here in the square that date back to the 1780s, but nobody knows of anybody who ever lived in them, which is not, I can't find it in a book or anything. The market house, which I'm facing here, was built by the Lamberts, and this ultimately it was to become the courthouse for Kilbeggan for many years. The Kilbeggan market was famous because they had so much, the meat, groceries, wool, everything was there, and I always remember there's a Cheap John was a man here when we were kids, and you could come down and try and buy a toy off him. So I saw two guns in a holster, and what you could do is exchange something. So I couldn't think of anything except my father's suit, and I took it out of the wardrobe. I came round this actual square heading towards to hand it over. My mother caught me about 20 yards short. I wasn't treated too well for a little while after that, but that was the life that it was there. And even around the square, just to mention the families, the Kelleher's, Kellys, Dunnicans, Morans, McManus's, Palmer's, Smith's, Guilfoyles, Finley's, and across the way there was Quinn's Hotels, Steadman's Bakery, O'Reilly's, and here we have the Bank of Ireland. And the Bank of Ireland, it was in Kilbeggan for many years, but it was established here in Kilbeggan in 1872 and continued until 1941 when it was demoted to a sub-office. It's closed because a number of people having bank accounts, it might remind us of the present,
were fewer and people not using cheques. The loss of the monthly cattle and sheep fairs brought the changes that ultimately ended it. Now, when you ever look at who worked in the bank, the names were W.A. Scott, R.P. Finch, James Butler, G.R. Douglas, not very, what you call, truly Irish, so it was very much non-Catholic it was run by, you know. And one other thing about the square is the Eucharistic Congress was over in the far square there, and Mr. Smith, where John Deegan's house is, and Mr. Sweeney, and he had a wireless and he put it in the window, and around 30 people listened to it, and Count John McCormack was singing coming out of the house. Some people have white and red papal flags. And there was also over there the two undertakers, Finleys and Buckleys, who had an ornate horse. Joe Condren worked for them and dressed up in a top hat and a black coat. So they were very up into things like that, you know. In 1899 here in Kilbeggan, there was a big meeting in the courthouse when Kilbeggan had an opportunity to become Offaly. It was part of the Tullamore Union for many years, and then the county councils were being set up in 1899. So Kilbeggan got the offer: you can stay in Offaly and win more All-Irelands, or you can go the other way. So there was a meeting here, 800 people were here, and they had to make this decision. And this final score was, amazingly, 799 to 1. One person wanted to go to Offaly out of 800. So that actually could have happened. As I said, you would have had more All-Irelands, so that was just a small thing here. The other thing to mention, just related to the famine, just out there, soup was given out during the famine from a wooden noggin at the market house here behind me, and Indian rice was brought in, and kids used to put it in a tin, and this is a fact, that, and heat it in a tin can until it was soft enough to eat, and then they would eat it with their fingers, like. So that was, I do know, like a number of places, like Kelly's down the town, they all helped with food and all that, but it did come down to that kind of a level at a point. A very historic figure came to Kilbeggan in August 1919, and it was Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, a remarkable woman by any means. She suddenly came into Kilbeggan after being down in Coolad at an Ariacht, and addressed the crowds in the square. There was a crowd of 400 or 500, but 10 officers wouldn't allow her. John McGuinness, the local leader, debated with the police, but decided to go ahead. The police made a charge, and she was struck, and a Mr. O'Kelly, a Sinn Féin, and both were injured. And she was almost senseless from behind, and so she was stunned, but was rescued by the crowd. And John McGuinness tried to get him, and he beat back the crowds. And she was such a remarkable figure. She was a co-founder of Irish Women's Franchise League and Workers' Union. She was arrested in 1913, and of course her husband Francis was shot dead by an English officer in 1916. She sought an inquiry, and they tried to bribe her, basically give her money, and she refused. And she was well in with the great figures like De Valera, Lloyd George, and she went to USA in missions in 1922. She did say one very odd thing, all right. She once said that James Connolly was the finest feminist amongst all the Labour men. So we don't know what that means. She sent a letter to Kilbeggan all about it, which I have a copy of at home. And two men, Garrett O'Reilly, who lived in the square in the corner, and James Clavin, they were arrested. And the funny thing is, they were over there and everything was happening here, but they're still arrested, and they were fined. But Garrett O'Reilly refused to pay the fine, and he went to jail for a month. Of course, he became a great hero when he came home then. That's the advantage of the jail. So that was just that remarkable character that was in Kilbeggan. And just while I am here, you get strange things, and we say I'm looking up at the building here, but Paddy Phelan recounted about the black and tans that drove through the town shooting into houses, and when the Sinn Féin band's instruments were moved to Kelly's Dramatic Hall to set fire to it and marched through the town playing the instruments. But the oddest thing about it, they took the Irish instruments and they're playing all Irish music as they went up and down, you know, contrary to everything else they had done, you know. So I'm standing here and I'm looking back and remembering places in Kilbeggan, and I'm just going to mention some of them as I go along. In the past there was Kilbeggan Bakeries, Fitzgerald's at the back of Duffy's shop. There was Berry's Bakery and Stedman's. That's where Mrs. Berry lived beside Charlie Kelly's. And then more recent times, the Halfway House, the Black Kettle, and places like that. And then you go down to Michael Finlay, and he did drapery with 2 milliners, undertakers and everything worked there. And on top, then you come to Garrett O'Reilly. He had a travelling shop with large horse-drawn carts filled with groceries, and which he delivered. In 1982, I'd just like to mention 2 particular people, Paddy Cooler Baker, and as many people know, he was blind. He was in his 80s and a part of our history. He could play music, sing, tell stories, and he famously was in a film in 1971 for the National Council. There was also a great person like Kit Carton who helped many people. He was associated with the races. He was kind, generous, worked in the distillery, recalled stories, and loved his songs like The Yellow Rose of Texas. And then there was Guilfoyles. There was Guilfoyles here, Guilfoyles round the corner where they had the shop. And behind them, beside them was Grahan's with Sean, Jim, Maura and Johnny. These were all part of a life. And that was the era when you went in for biscuits. You actually put your hand into biscuits, put them out into a bag, and put your hand into another place and put them in the bag. So that was a part of it. And even down the hill, Breed and Harry Kelly, you know, they had a beautiful coffee shop. But more than that, they won qualified for a national award in Bewley's because the quality was so good. So these are people to remember. The other thing I just want to mention as I'm looking at it, it is the brewery in Kilbeggan. We often hear bits about. We had a brewery with a shop, grocery, wine and spirits, and a store. And the brewery was known for its fine Egan ales and porter. It produced a brewery behind the main street. Kelly's malting supplied both the distillery and Egan's. They continued to supply it to the distillery and to the people, so people often wondered about it. The brewery had 2 stories, slated building, and even within it was a famous pump worked by hand with 2 horsepower machine and a supply of spring water from a well. So that was exceptional. Now I suppose maybe not everybody knows that we had a rebellion in 1798 in Kilbeggan. Matthias McManus, who owned a distillery at the time, and he had a son called John, and John was very political. So tragically, he sent a letter saying he could put 3,400 men on the streets of Kilbeggan, and he was arrested and ultimately killed. But the 1798 rebellion carried on. At 11 o'clock on the 16th of June 1798, the British forces put their men up at the barricade where John Whelans is. At the break of day, 1,000 marched up the street, and some of them were wearing white paper bands around their heads, with officers wearing green sashes, clean shirts. Some of them had a piece of oat bread in their pockets and a pitchfork, and that was their main weapon, bear in mind. They came in bands of 60 to 100 people. The barricades were between Whelans, as I said, and across the road. The march from the hill of Doon, where Fox's is, up the hill past the Volunteer Inn to the barricades, but the British soldiers fired bullets of shots at them. The cavalry then charged with their swords and cut them down. Around 120 rebels were killed over a number of hours from Kilbeggan to Ballinagore. The lane at the back of Whelans to Londis dates back to the 17th century, and it was this area that the army gathered. Kilbeggan was considered a dangerous place by the authorities, and in fact it was considered so dangerous that the British soldiers stayed for another 13 years in Kilbeggan with 154 privates, 117 horses, 12 officers and 40 privates. And I'd say the pubs in Kilbeggan did well at that time. The offices were based around where Dr. Jerry Flynn's house is. One of the strangest things of all in the square is that it was full of soldiers, but a man called John MacDonough lived in the square, and very strangely he burst out of his house with the pike and he attacked one of the officers and tried to kill him. Obviously he was arrested and executed, but he wasn't the smartest ever to do that. And the story was he ran down Puddle Lane and escaped to Tullamore. But that was a great thing in Irish history. They were always escaping, but it was never proved that they ever did. So that was the sad thing. 120 people were killed, and Ballinagar in particular suffered badly. Knighting of an innkeeper. That's a great story that relates very much to Kilbeggan. The Volunteer Inn was famous from the 1790s because of the knighting of Thomas and Mary Cuff by the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. It should also be mentioned that John Wayne dropped into the same place in 1950 and had a drink there. In modern times, it was the basis of a knighthood festival in Kilbeggan from 2012 to 2016. The Lord Lieutenant was travelling through Kilbeggan and the main road was where the Harbour Road is now, when his coach broke down and could not be fixed. He had to stay with his staff in the Volunteer Inn in Kilbeggan. He was expecting the worst, but the owners had the famous Kilbeggan whisky. The Lord Lieutenant had a great evening, and he was so inebriated that he decided to knight Thomas Cuff. The following morning, the staff tried to stop him, obviously. The following morning, he realised what he had done and tried to persuade Thomas to forget about it. And like a good Irishman, Thomas said he'd do it himself for a consideration, but his good wife would not give up her title. So Lady Mary never gave up her title. In fact, she used it by putting up the painting for visitors, and she was able to make a profit in her hotel, and she lived until she was 13 years later. There was the other thing to go with the story is that the roof above us, where it is lower than the other buildings, and that goes back to somebody was staying in the hotel and they got the fever. Everybody left him for days and days until he died, and then he was lowered down and taken away, but nobody would stay in the room. So the story is that that's why they lowered the roof of it. Now we're standing here beside the Garda station in Kilbeggan. The building was previously the RIC barracks. Before 1836, Ireland had no regular police force. Local magistrates appointed a local constable, and these local constables were called landlord pets. They had no specific uniform, or they were underpaid. By 1836, a bill was passed, and the first named the Irish Constabulary. It was renamed the Royal Irish Constabulary, or RIC. Kilbeggan was one of the first towns to have it. In 1843, the famous Lord Norbury, while returning from Mullincar Courthouse, was shot and killed outside Kilbeggan. The killer was captured by Inspector Shields, stationed in Kilbeggan RIC in March 1922. The RIC was disbanded. A new force tried to replace them. The Civic Guards arrived in Kilbeggan there to store the police. A great quote was that one man remarked to the local sergeant, 4 guards in Kilbeggan, surely you don't need that number. The sergeant replied, no, but we would if they weren't here. And just to mention one last thing, the guards remembered in Kilbeggan because they are very famous were Sergeant Doyle, Michael Buchan, Michael O'Neill, Bernard McPaul, John Kelleher, and more recently John Sheehy and Mick Feeney. At one point there was 12 constables and 3 sergeants and a chief officer. I'm just standing outside the Kilbeggan Protestant graveyard here. After the work reviving the graveyard in the Protestant church, it brought to light many stories. About 28 gravestones are in there. The gravestones reveal stories about travel from Ireland to Australia, a young woman described as the first female paediatrician in Ireland, the 1798 rebellion, the founding of Kilbeggan Distillery, the knighthood story, the ribbonmen and secret societies, cattle driving, a rector who had an affair with the wife of Kilbeggan MP John Philpott Curran, and a Wesleyan who provided the first building for the Sisters of Mercy. All of these stories are in here, and just to mention in particular, the most interesting one, Dr. Catherine Maguire. She was the first place in her class of all, which was all men except her. She became a professor of Alexandra College. She opened a free dispensary at Harold's Cross for the poor, with particular reference to women and children. She bought 4 tenement houses in Tyrone Street, Dublin, managing them herself, and then let them at the minimum rate to the poor. So there's all those kinds of stories, and I would hope that the Westmeath County Council, or whoever is responsible, there could be a great opportunity if this was cleaned up and available, and even with people down at the tours, down in the distillery, there would be a great opportunity to have a good tourist place here. But I'm standing beside the plaque for the Plaza Hall. I remember when this was put up with Siggy Daly and Kitty Flynn. And this was Kilbeggan before the hall, in a sense. Tommy Kelly was a businessman, auctioneer, secretary of the race committee, owned the Plaza Hall. He started a drapery in spacious 3-storey buildings on Main Street, leased originally by Jeremiah Booth, Protestant. And this went on. He was a small, striking figure, dressed in dark pinstripe suits with a black bowler hat and a rose in a buttonhole. Kelly had plays, dances, etc., and called it the Plaza Hall. And indeed, many famous people came here, and Count John McCormack. They came from miles on bicycles for shows, plays, Irish dancing, ceilidhs, etc. It entertained people until the hall opened in 1944. So that kind of. I'm just standing down where the hills, down at the hill and the houses here. Now it's not possible to put down all the names, but I'm going to mention some parts about the actual hill. These tradesmen houses had 2 stories at the front and 3 stories at the back, with a trapdoor down to the workshop area. The houses had an archways in front to sell goods. Every kind of trade was to offer along the street in the past. The craftsmen ranged from basket makers to harness makers. The houses on the hill were originally used to house military personnel, as there was a large barracks in Kilbeggan. The houses ran up to the old post office, which was the officers' headquarters. Each house had a basement with a trapdoor. An archway was discovered, and this was used to allow horses and carriages around the back of the houses, and the horses were kept beneath the house. When the militia left, the houses were altered and archways closed. In 1992, the County Council altered the hill and developed a new house. In time, the houses were built with archways and courtyards. Many families lived on the side coming from the Galway, like Keoghan's, Gavin Smith's, and Doonan's, McCormack's, Clavin's, Paddy Keoghan's, Carey's, Ned Rooney, Martin Craig, Anthony Trodden, Joe Hurley. And I'm going to take a supply of some of them from the wonderful Malty Carey, Paddy Wire, Martin Creevy. Paddy and Jack Neal worked in Donegan's, but Mrs. Fleming, Paddy Rattigan, and Nanny Riley. McCormack's lived at the top house and Paddy Keoghan down at the end. That's just a sample of the people who lived here and grew up here, and it's very important. Just to mention, when I am here, I'm looking across, and there used to be always a bonfire just where the river is, and at the very end of the hill to my left, near the Brosnan River, to bring over Kelly's trailer by Anthony Trodden beside Keoghan's house and to deal with it through the window. St. James's clubmen played music there, and Bobby Gorman, Des Coughlin and others. I'm just standing here looking down at the river here just beside the distillery, and there's a few little tidbits of stories that you mightn't hear as you you go around the distillery and that. And I just thought I might just bring them up. The most dramatic one was the Great Fire of the 23rd of May 1878. And if you were standing here, this is what you would have seen. Where the fire occurred, it was saved because hundreds of people turned out to help save it, as vats of whiskey went off in single puffs of flame. That'll be just behind us here. The local inspector, Mr. Hamilton, saved thousands of pounds worth of property as the fire was heading to the bonded stores, which had a large amount of whiskey. The excise officer would not unlock the doors so he can see the events. So Inspector Hamilton took over. He gave the order, smash down the door, which again behind us. The property must be saved. A sledgehammer was brought up, the door was smashed, and thousands of barrels rolled out onto the street here in Kilbeggan, and all the people were out. A reporter at the scene was shown the pipe which the cooper cut in time. 1 minute more, he said, and all this would have been blown up. Mr. Finlay, the distiller, he also took part, was also present as he released barrels into the Brosna River and let them float down as the blaze was about to reach it. It was a very dramatic moment, and the town could have actually lost the distillery. Another little interesting story is, I don't know if you've ever saw the film Far and Away, Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman. It involves whiskey and the era of the 1880s. In the film set in the 1880s, there's a very interesting scene when the landlord decides to have a whiskey. And I remember when I froze it on the TV screen, you could see it was Locke's whiskey, which was very correct, as Locke's whiskey production at this time was at its best 157,000 gallons. It was 60,000 only a few years before. It was the golden era with many businesses in the town: brewery, flour mills, wool store, 5 forges. Kilbeggan also had Egan's Brewery, flour and wheat mills in Coolagh, Clavin's Chandlery, the Canal Harbour, Rooney's Foundry, Kelly's Wool Store just up the road, etc. So it was very successful, and the town was probably at its best. Another key moment in the history of the distillery was the Kilbeggan Developed Association. They had a wheel. When the people of Kilbeggan got together to restore the wheel in 1983, the key moment, and it was a great moment, and a symbol of it being saved. Ironically, 2 locals, Sean and Frank Kyogan, had the turning of the wheel, and their father, John, was working in the distillery when the wheel stopped 30 years before. So it is a very iconic moment for everyone. On another occasion, where the distillery was very important, and it was also a big event in Kilbeggan, the night of the big wind, the 6th of January 1839, it was Little Christmas and the land was covered in heavy snowfall. The eerie calm of the day showed something was about to happen, and it did. At that point, a candle could burn in the open air without the faintest attempt of a flicker. It was so still that the voices could be heard in other farms. But around 9 o'clock the storm began as a light breeze, and within hours it was a furious storm, and policemen in the town were scooped up and thrown back on the ground. The roof of a thatched house fell and caught fire in a few moments. The local inhabitants, some of them had to run naked into fields, leaving all their property. Those who continued went into the fields and hid behind ditches. It continued for a while, and the difference here, the importance of the distillery, was that it was going to burn down the houses coming in the Moat Road, and it was only an open space plus the distillery building and adjoining stores prevented the houses being burnt down. One of the most astonishing things was the blowing slates out of the canal. They're literally blown out of the canal, and a post was measured. It flew through the air and struck a post 157 yards away. In Kilbeggan they were going to celebrate that into the future, but unfortunately the famine came after that, and they never did that. So they're just some small stories that tell you a little bit about the distillery. Bushmills claim to be the oldest in Ireland, whisky wise. They based their claim on a quote in 1608, but there was no evidence that they actually did do it. So Kilbeggan can claim having the oldest pot still distillery in the world, and they do say it. It happened in 1784. It's more than likely the distillery was founded then. In 1886, the distillery was at its best, producing 157,000 gallons. It is a great story of adventure, adversity, fairy tale success, and some failure. Sadly, the stories are not recounted on tours so much. I'll not say too much about that. In 1782, there was 3 distilleries, the Codds, McManus's and Patrick Brett. And by 1796 it was down to one, Matthias McManus. What we really associate them with is John Locke. He came from Kildare and worked in the distillery in Tullamore. He married one of Jane Smithy and of the Kilkenny brewing family. In the 1830s, the opening of the Grand Canal increased the importance and improved the delivery. Locke's James or Jimmy, he was also very much involved in things like the local races, and he gave out oatmeal soup plus money and clothing to families, especially in the famine years. Later on it was John Edward Locke, Brosna House and James Harvey who were responsible. They were good employers in that the distillery houses which people bought or rented for people, they had cow and calf park, grazed them on the land for £5 per annum, but you had to take them home each evening. During World War I, the average wage was £1 plus employment on their land when the distillery wasn't operating. In 1970, a war bonus of £5 was paid at 2 shillings per week, and this was for all the employees in the distillery. That would be all the employees in Kilbeggan. Now it went on to have all its problems with the lock scandal and closing down, but there was a saviour was about to come. The Kilbeggan Community Association, they received grants and set it up, and very cleverly they concentrated on the most important thing, and that was the wheel, and the whole focus at the beginning, and it was a tremendous success. In 1992, first Locks Distillery Festival took place with vintage rallies and the first new case of Locks Distillery. In 1994 they launched Locks Whisky Tyrconnell and won awards. Cooley was the only Irish owned and first distillery in the 20th century. There are a few people who actually had a great preference for the whisky, and one of them was Winston Churchill. He had a particular liking for Locks Distillery, and Miles Nagopoline or Flann O'Brien. He was an excise officer with a Kilbeggan connection, and that was their drink. Here I am sitting outside the window of the house that was once Dr. Dan O'Sullivan, who was so important to Kilbeggan. He died at 83 in Harold's Cross in 1999. Born in Ferns, County Kerry in 1916, and a great intellect. A diary he had in 1934 indicates he was reading everything he could. He studied at UCD, began his career in Cork, joined the Army Medical Corps. He practiced as a GP and assistant county coroner in Kilbeggan for half a century. And very interestingly, when he was asked by his daughter when would he retire, he said 2 weeks after the funeral. So that'd be his kind of sense of humour. But he loved good food and drink, botanical gardens out at the back with the exotic plants, and he was Sir Alfred Chester Beatty's physician for many years. He listened to people and was loved and respected by many of his patients. He was also associated with many committees, including the Race Committee, Locks Distillery, Town Development Association, striving to improve Kilbeggan. Okay, we're just standing outside a shop that used to be Nannery's. Mrs. Anne Nannery made hundreds of maroon and white flags decorating the lower Main Street. She made bunting, and her husband Matt Nannery never missed a match at Westmeath. and they even got visitors from Oxford to buy the maroon jerseys. And that's just a tidbit about a family that had a shop here that many of us grew up with and used to go into. Down here at the end of the town, and as you know, there was a number of shops here, and just to mention Mrs. Annie and Tom Walsh, the shop down the street that people used to go to as they came out of school. Mrs. Walsh, of course, was teaching in the school, and they looked after. They've always been looked after the school, looked after the church, and a very important family in Kilbeggan. Okay. Tommy Whelan, he was born in Rochford Bridge, and the family had a pub and farm, but he was an umpire in the match between Dublin and Croke Park when the crowd forces opened fire and killed 14 people. He was advised to carry an ID. He was only 16, but umpires didn't turn up as the IRA had killed 15 early in the morning. He was asked to do the umpire in the match. He was where Michael Hogan, the Tipperary man, was shot, and he was one of the first to come to his assistance. He played for Rochford Bridge Warriors and won senior medals with them. He played for Westmeath when they beat Offaly in 1918. He ran the distillery in the square in Kilbeggan, and he later played football for Kilbeggan and won county senior titles. 1925, 27, 30, 31 and 35. He worked in the distillery and bought small shops, had a small shop. In 1954, he purchased a well-known grocery shop on Bridge Street, formerly owned by Mary J. Convey. He was chairman of the local committee of the hall. He died in 1975 and is buried in Glasnevin, but he is very much remembered in Kilbeggan. Just standing here in the old Boys National School, which was built in 1938. It was erected in a large three-teacher school and was modern at that time, up-to-date type of building, and made waterproof red brick chimney and window sills. 3 classrooms, 2 cloakrooms and a teacher's room with fresh water and 2 toilet basins. Electric lights were even installed and school equipment included, all wave wireless. 2 play sheds with suitable seating and a tarmac playground. A new security entrance to stop kids rushing out the main gate. A football ground was being constructed and it all cost 3,000. On a sad note, the old school was demolished in May 1939. The principal was P.T. Jordan, and he retired in 1966 from Kilbeggan School after 34 years. I suppose not everyone can say that the years in the school were the best time of their lives, but there were good things. He set up boys' flageolet band and first appearances on St. Patrick's Day in 1933 in the green tunics, the saffron kits and the green caps, the school football team and committee. Mrs. Walsh and Vincent Ryan were then teaching after that, and Vincent took over as principal and even organised printing a school newspaper named The Echo in 1969. In the 1980s, the issue amalgamating the 2 schools came up, and in 1997 it was controversial, but it ultimately proceeded. The other thing that I suppose relates to being here was that there was 2 brickworks, one at the boys' school, Carney's had it, and so had Nannery's. Plenty of brick clay in Kilbeggan was used to bring bricks as far as Multifarnham and Mullingar. Drivers got 6pence a day for their expense. The Reliquary Road used to bleach the flax for linen. Tom Nannery gave site for the National School. They owned a brick factory there with Carney's and used to sell the briquettes. In the 1930s, Tom Nannery gave the site to the boys' school. It opened in 1938 to P. Father Cassidy. The place at the boundary wall of the school was called the Black Man. It was reference to soot emitting from the brick kiln. Here I am standing on the stage of St. James's Hall, which I used to be in, like many other people over the years, and brings back memories of everything from dances to sports, everything. So just to tell you a bit about it, on Sunday the 13th of April 1945, the new parochial hall was opened. The cinema operator was Tom Guilfoyle.
The hall could accommodate around 500 people with its pine floor stage, cloakrooms, supper room and balcony at the back of the hall. It cost around 1,620. The cinema gave many years of pleasure with comedy, drama, war and westerns, gangsters and even horror movies. I even remember the nuns let us out of school on an afternoon to watch a Dracula film, which seems very strange many years later. Films were shown from Monday to Friday with 2 showings on Sunday, including a matinee, with double features, weekly serials and the Pate News that everyone remembers. The first ever movie in Kilbeggan was on Easter Sunday, the 15th of April, 1945 at 8 p.m. and it was Men of Boys Town. This was a follow-up to the original Boys Town films and it starred Spencer Tracy as Father Flanagan and Mickey Rooney. The first matinee was the same film on the 16th of April at 4:30 p.m. The admission was 1 shilling and 2p, 9p and 7p on the Sunday, and 552 people attended. The takings on the first night were over £27, which was good. There was a government tax at that time for anything like this, but the way out of it was to get musicians to come in and play music before the film, and by doing that you bypassed the tax, so it was a clever thing to do. Seats were brought from Joe Coffey's on the Dublin Road and screwed together when there was dances. Many local families were involved, like Tom Guilfoyle, Mick Smith took tickets, Etna McLannan, Gerard and Frank Smith, Willie Barry, Des Coughlin, Mrs. Carey and Malty. They were all associated with this place. And they were involved many over the years. Films were on Sunday, Wednesday and Friday. And people came from surrounding areas to see the big movies. And you could go to Siggy Daly's and Coffees and Klein's to get your sweets beforehand or ice pops. The last film actually here was around 1967. Dances were regular with big orchestras in the 1940s like Ralph Sylvester, Mick Delaney and our own Andy Hennessy, who was the first out, I suppose, from this area. And all the local musicians over the years, like the Coughlins, Bobby Gorman, the Keogans, Ned Carey, Ned Rooney, Sean Gallagher, John Gorman, PJ Ward, Kelly Sisters, bands like the Sailors, Crackaways, Pushing Still, John Hogan, and not forgetting the boys band. The big crowds travelled on the bikes, etc. And the green was sometimes, there was a little story that it was snowing one time, and you can just picture people walking up past Siggy Daly's and all that in their hundreds and the snow, but a bunch of kids got the snowballs in the green and let fly at them, and many of them were soaked, and as one local man called them, they were pups, he says. Dances were held for parish socials, carnivals, raising funds, car drives, sales of work, concerts, auctions, and for local committees. And Flinsfield beside the hall was a wonderful place for the kids, and the dances brought people from everywhere with up to 800 attending at a time. No alcohol was allowed, and you couldn't leave until the music was over. It was a golden era of Mick Delahunty and Joe Dolan and Paddy Cole later. And then, of course, the hall was also a place for drama, and over many years with brilliant local casts with different generations of actors from the 1940s through to the 1990s, which was a great era for that, produced many plays on stage. Later there were sports like badminton, kung fu, and of course bingo, which started in the 1950s. It has been used in modern times for elections as a district court and by the local schools. Kitty Flynn is now 96-year-old as I talk now. She's a remarkable woman since her birth in 1926. I had the pleasure of interviewing her a few years ago in the Parish Centre to honour her Life Achievement Award for outstanding contribution to Kilbeggan in the Parish Hall. It was held in the Parish Hall. It told a story of growing up during the emergency, the Eucharistic Congress, World War II, the War of Independence, emigration. She grew up with vivid accounts of the War of Independence as described by her mother, including accounts of national figures like Michael Collins, Hannah Sheehy Skeffington and Count John McCormack. She emigrated to Britain in 1945 and became a lifelong supporter of Arsenal, would you believe, to this day, because I was talking to her the other day and she was watching them on the television. Flynn's restaurant in the 1960s was called the Leicester, with full lunches and 7 tables, with orange lilies in the windows. And she told me that a lot of North of Ireland people used to eat there, and this was the connection. And the Hibernia Bank was just beside the house. When she came home, she worked as a teacher in a number of schools and wrote 2 books on Kilbeggan's history, and one, and the 1798 rebellion in Kilbeggan with myself. She embraced email and Facebook and still does at this point in time, and at 96 still keeps writing and contacting people. She graduated with a BA in Community and Family Studies from NUI Galway at the age of 87. She was involved in many events in the town, from the reopening of Lock's Distillery, the Young at Heart, ICA, and as secretary of the Canal Committee, she signed off on a $500,000 investment in the Kilbeggan Harbour project. So this astonishing woman, thankfully, is still with us. So she is my hero, I have to say.
The Marilla statue behind us, this is what we're just going to mention now. It was the Marian year in 1954, and we're going to the erection of Our Lady statue. The memorial was a copy of the painting of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary by Marilla from the 17th century, which was in Louvre. An estimately cost £500 or £600 at the end of the town, but the people put it together. It arrived in September 1954 from France. It was made of cast iron and finished in white, mounted on a pedestal 16 foot high and illuminated at night. There was a big parade for the event with the boys' band and a unit of the army with Sean Flynn. We're here in the GAA grounds in Kilbeggan and looking a bit at its old history. The Kilbeggan GAA had had notable success over the years, but its great era was in 1990 and 1935, when they won 7 Westmeath football titles. This year, just recently, it was the 100th anniversary of their first win in 1990. I remember we had a celebration with John Horan, the president of the GAA, and it was remembered, that event. The first Kilbeggan team registered was Kilbeggan Volunteers, and the first recorded match was when Kilbeggan Nationals beat the Mullingar Shamrocks by 1-3 to a point on the 18th of May 1890. Loughnagore was to be the site of the revival of Kilbeggan races in 1901, but in April 1896 a football match took place between the Kilbeggan Wolf Tones and Cloneyhagh Ramblers in Loughnagore. The GAA went into decline over the years, and their only success was the Sir Walter Nugent Cup, which they won 3 consecutive years from 1913. And the funny thing is, in the following years, following the Easter Rising, GAA began to move closer to Sinn Féin, and clubs had to get permission to play matches. At least 7 of the Kilbeggan team joined Sinn Féin: John McGuinness, Jimmy McGuinness, Joe Rourke, Jack Guilfoyle, Frank McGuinness, Jack Langan and Jack Guilfoyle. And members of the team were often on the run, and John McGuinness was arrested in Kilbeggan for organising a military unit. By 1919, Kilbeggan was one of the greatest, strongest clubs, and they were determined to win their first title. It took time. It proved far too strong for Kinnegad, winning comfortably in 1919 by 1-7 to 1-1, and they were controlled the whole match. So this ends our stroll down memory lane from the green right down to the end of the town. I would have liked to put in more things, but the whole idea is to get the word out to Kilbeggan people. And it's not, when I say Kilbeggan people, I mean it in a broader perspective. As people know from online stuff, that there's many people in Australia, America and around the world who are very interested in the history of Kilbeggan. And my objective has always been, I did 6 books and tours, and we did the festival and all of that. The thing is recorded, because I grew up with great people like Gus Marshall and that, but the records weren't kept. So everything that I did is somewhere, and this is another element of it, a brand new one, and we hope that it'll be available for all the people who are interested in Kilbeggan, and it'll be an opportunity for people to talk about things. And so I can't say much more. This is 2022. So I will wind up with that, and I hope to see you and talk to you into the future. Okay.